Indonesia and the United States have finally reached a trade deal after President Prabowo Subianto made a brief phone call to President Donald Trump when he was in Paris to find a fair solution that could give mutual benefits to both countries last week.
President Prabowo Subianto and President Donald Trump spoke for nearly 17 minutes on the phone call on Tuesday, July 15th, resulting in the United States cutting its import tariffs on Indonesian exports from 32% down to 19%, according to an official statement from Indonesia's Cabinet Secretariat. The deal helps Indonesia to avert the U.S. 32% tariff threat, which, if implemented, could lead to massive layoffs in the country's labor-intensive industries, such as footwear and textile manufacturers, which mostly rely on the U.S. to export their products. The 19% tariff is lower than 20% and 35% respectively, imposed on Vietnam and Bangladesh, Indonesia's main competitors in the U.S. textile market. The agreement with the U.S. was reached after rounds of negotiations between the two countries' trade negotiation teams since President Trump first announced the 32 reciprocal tariffs on Indonesian exports in April 2025. The tariff was then delayed for 90 days to give rooms for negotiations. The latest Indonesian delegation, led by Coordinating Minister Erlangga Hartarto, departed the U.S. on Tuesday, July the 8th, to make second-best offers just a day after President Trump announced that U.S. trade partners, including Indonesia, would pay the high reciprocal tariffs on August the 1st if they failed to meet a trade deal in favor of the U.S. In a post on his Truth Social platform on Tuesday, July the 15th, President Trump announced that the U.S. would impose a 19% tariff on Indonesia after the country planned to make big purchases from the U.S. and to remove tariff barriers on American investment in the Southeast Asian largest economy. They are going to pay 19% and we are going to pay nothing. We will have full access into Indonesia, Trump said outside the Oval Office earlier. Speaking to journalists following his arrival from Paris at the Halim Perdana Kusuma Airport on Wednesday, President Prabowo said that it was tough negotiation with President Trump, but the two leaders finally agreed to make a trade deal in which the U.S. would reduce tariff on Indonesian exports to 19% from 32%. The most important thing in deal is to protect Indonesian workers from losing their jobs, President Prabowo said, adding that the protection of the Indonesian workers is a top priority in the government's economic policy. The U.S. has become the largest contributor to Indonesia's trade surplus in recent years. In 2024, Indonesia's exports to the U.S. reached $25.31 billion, while imports amounted to $11.97 billion, resulting in a surplus of $14.34 billion. During the January to April period, the surplus reached $5.44 billion, the largest recorded by Indonesia, followed by $3.98 billion, with Indonesia in the second position, and $2.92 billion with the Philippines in the third place. Observers described the deal as a win-win solution for both countries, although Indonesia would not only to pay high tariff, but also to remove investment barriers for U.S. companies.
President Donald Trump has agreed to lower the reciprocal tariff on Indonesian goods to 19% from the previous 32% as part of the trade deal he made with President Prabowo recently. And we have our guest, Bapak Muhammad Zulfikar Rahmat. He's the director of RE China Desk at CELIOS, and he will review positive and negative aspects of the Indonesia-U.S. trade deal. Hello, Pak Muhammad Zulfikar Rahmat.
Hello, Mbak.
Hello. Thank you so much for being with us here via video call on Economic Outlook. Pak Zulfikar, the United States has agreed to lower the tariff on Indonesian exports down to 19%, and this is part of the trade deal between Indonesia and United States. And in return, Indonesia has to remove all tariffs and non-tariff barriers on U.S. products as well as all the investment. What do you think of this deal so far?
I think the deal is good, but it is highly imbalanced. On the one hand, Indonesia wins some of the price. We avoided a 32% tariff and instead secure a 19% rate on our export. But while this sounds like a concession won, Indonesia has surrendered much more. All tariff and non-tariff barriers on U.S. import extending across energy, electronic, aerospace, agriculture, pharmaceutical, and other sectors. And I believe that this structure would introduce some structural risk into Indonesia's trade balance, especially because our tariff relief is modest compared to, for example, Vietnam, which achieved a reduction from 46% to 20%. So practically this deal offers short-term stability and preserve jobs in our export, but it is far from transformative. And by allowing a fraud of zero tariff U.S. goods while still paying a 19% tariff on our export, we may have ceded significant leverage in our trade talk with Washington.
So basically, this deal is good enough for the short term for the stability of Indonesia, but not for the transformative economy that we are expecting. Now, with this 90% tariff, though, do you think that our own Indonesian product can still be able to compete in the U.S. market?
I think yes, they can, although competition will become tougher. Indonesia now has the lowest American tariff among ASEAN members, 19% versus 20% for Vietnam and 21 for the Philippines and 25 for Malaysia and 36 for Thailand. That preferential rate does provide us relative advantage, especially in labor-intensive goods such as garment, footwear, palm oil, rubber, and electronics. But the cost burden remains significant. Exporters will need to decide whether to absorb some of the tariff themselves or pass it down to the value chain to remain competitive. And those are factors that could erode profit margin or lead them to focus on other markets.
Okay, let's talk more about our imports now. Under the agreement, the U.S. companies will pay nothing or in fact have a zero tariff for their exports to Indonesia. Do you think that these zero tariffs given to the U.S. goods will hurt our local products?
Absolutely, particularly in several sectors, and several reports have shown that we are expecting substantial inflows of energy, high-end electronic, aerospace parts, cereal, pharmaceutical. Some even estimate import in those categories hitting around 5.37 billion US dollars. And that increase will almost certainly widen our oil and gas trade deficit, weaken our currency, and escalate pressure on energy subsidy. Now, the government budget, 2026 budget anticipated 203 trillion rupiah in energy subsidies. But given the current price trend and import volume, that could swell to between 300 and say 120 trillion rupiah. And this would also threaten local producers. Zero tariff will undermine domestic grain and noodle manufacturers, while unfettered access for U.S. machinery, electronic, and pharmaceutical might flood our local industry. So yes, local producers face considerable pressure unless the government intervenes to support them through subsidy reform, standard enhancement, or targeted industrial policies.
Right, it is a very tricky situation indeed. Now, Pak Zulfikar, can you please elaborate more on what would be the U.S.'s main exports to Indonesia and what kind of products that will face a head-to-head competition with our own Indonesian products, and which market will actually hurt the most because of this tariff imposed?
I think the key U.S. export to Indonesia would include energy, and those are both oil and gas, and then also agricultural products like wheat, corn, soybean, cotton, and then also growing aircraft, sophisticated machinery, and also drug or pharmaceutical. In some sectors, such as energy and aircraft, there is little domestic production in Indonesia, so I think competition will be limited. But in agricultural sector, like wheat, corn, this import directly compete with our farmer and food processors. Meanwhile, I think lower tariff on machinery and pharmaceutical could also eat into domestic manufacturing, especially if Indonesian industries are not yet ready to compete in terms of price and quality.
Right. Now, if we can just shift our focus to the major project that is supposed to come into Indonesia. Indonesia has, in fact, also promised to remove non-tariff barriers on U.S. investments, such as through the removal of the local content rules. Now, one of the major projects coming in should be the Apple's U.S. $1 billion investment plan in Indonesia. How will that come into effect?
I think removing local content rules will certainly remove obstacles for companies like Apple, and it also streamlines supply chain management and enables foreign companies to bring in components more freely. But that also means fewer guarantees that investment will also translate into local supplier partnership. And without balancing measures like compulsory technology or skill transfer requirement or sourcing threshold, the chance to build up domestic industries, especially in the electronic sector, could be lost. So while Apple investment is more likely to go ahead, we should not assume significant gains for local supplier unless the government explicitly requires those requirements.
Hmm. Now, one of the strategies that Indonesia can make to still improve our economy is, in fact, beginning to gradually shifting our exports, maybe slightly away from the U.S. to avoid the high tariffs, and in fact, exports to other countries. Where do you think the next promising markets is to expand our own Indonesian exports?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you that we should definitely diversify to reduce our vulnerability to American tariff. And I think now the most promising market is the European Union via the Indonesia-EU CEPA, or Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which provide duty-free access for high-value exports like textile and palm oil. Then we have also LCEP member countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, who are already deeply integrated into our supply chains. Within ASEAN, existing CEPC tariff also provide an opportunity to deepen our economic relationship further. This market collectively offer the scale and structure that can enable Indonesia to shift some reliance away from American trade and protect ourselves against future geopolitical or tariff shocks.
Agree. So we need to, in fact, also change our strategy and improve our strategy so we become less dependent on just one strong country. Now, last question here, Pak Zulfikar, for the future. It seems like in the short term, our economy remains stable, but we still see that the geopolitical tension is still there, as well as the tariff war. Well, it's still somewhat uncertain for the future. How do you forecast our economy for the rest of the year?
I think our economy will face some obstacle in the coming several months, and I think the Indonesian government really need to take several steps to make sure that this won't happen, especially with the Trump still in power. I think the geopolitical situation is still also very difficult to predict, and I think the government needs to be prepared for this. And I think overall, the current deal with the Trump administration offer a short-term relief from the U.S. tariff escalation, but it is offset by significant concession and systematic danger, especially in several sectors, like I mentioned earlier. And I think to make this a strategic win rather than a temporary fix, Indonesia must rapidly accelerate energy transition and deepen trade or economic relationship with non-traditional partners, and also strengthen our domestic industry as well.
Okay, thank you so much for your insights on economic outlook today. That was Mr. Muhammad Zulfikar Rahmat, Director of Republic Indonesia-China Desk at CELIOS. Thank you so much. Have a good day. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.